And this story starts with a farmer, a widowed farmer named Crinnock. And Crinnock had 3 children. Now, he was a big lump of a man, all right? Wasn't great around the house, though, okay? You get people like that, right? Now, one day, he came back, and the house was spotless. And the children, they were asleep. And who was sitting there in the corner by the fire? But a beautiful young maiden he had never seen her. Beautiful red hair, brown eyes. And little did he know that this was Macha. She had come from the world of the she. And they sat beside the fire gently, and they looked at each other. And Crinnock knew that they were going to lie together. And so they did. And she made sweet love to him. And the next morning, he reached for her in the bed, but the space was empty. She was already up, and she was singing, and she was making breakfast. And he said, "This is amazing." And she went out into the fields, and he followed her, and she didn't know. And she saw she was herding the sheep, and she saw her. She would race after him. She raced like a whisper of wind. She turned into a blur as she heard the sheep, so fast was she. When she had finished, she turned, and she saw that Crinnock had followed her. And she came to him, and she said, "Crinnock, I will make sweet love to you. I will tend your house. I will tend your fields. I will rain great prosperity on the land. The only thing I ask is that you will not boast of me to others." Now, Crinnock at the time had just been thinking, I cannot wait to tell all the boys about my new girlfriend. But he said, okay, I agree to this. And so, just as she promised, her farm prospered, and she became pregnant by him. And Crinnock's status rose and rose, to the point where King Conor of Ulster had organised a great feast to celebrate the fact that he'd laid his hands on the finest horses that anyone had ever seen. He had got them from far from the south of the Middle Sea, from the land of sand. And he had brought them up, and he was hosting a feast. And through a friend, Crinnock was invited. But before he left, she placed his hand on her pregnant belly, and she made him promise again that he would not boast of her. And so he agreed. And he went to the feast. And he was drinking. And all he could hear was the men boasting about how their wives had the sweetest voice in all the province. And all he could think of was Macha's sweet voice when she made him breakfast in the morning. And he could hear them boasting about how their wives were the greatest cooks in the land. And all he could think of was those apple tarts she had made for him at Lunasa. And he kept drinking, and it was getting harder and harder to hold his tongue. And eventually, much later on, King Conor stood up and said, "My horses are faster than any creature on this land." And Crinnock stood up. You know those moments when you can see yourself doing something but you just can't stop it. And he said, "My wife is faster than your horses, and if they raced, she would win." Now, King Conor was known to be quite boastful, and the hall had went silent. And he said, "What will happen now? You will go and get your wife, and we will race them. And if she does not come, I'll have your head." And so the Red Branch Knights came to Macha, and she pleaded with them. She pointed to her pregnant belly. She told them, "I cannot possibly race." And the Red Branch Knights, they should be defending a woman like her, but they stayed silent. And all they said to her was, "No, you have to come." And so she came. And when Conor saw her, he could feel a strange feeling from her. And he ordered that his chariot be stripped down to the barest bone, so it would be as light as it could possibly be. And they came to the start. And they started. And Conor's horses raced ahead. And Macha struggled to start because of her pregnancy. But then a fire lit in her, one that burned strong. And if Conor's horses were fast, then she was like lightning. And she covered the distance in a flash of beauty. And she crossed the finish line just in time, the curve of her pregnant belly giving her the victory. Yet, all the exertion had rumbled her waters, and she let out a scream, a shriek, and she fell to her knees, and blood began to flow down her thighs as she went into labor. And still, the Red Branch Knights only watched, uncertain what to do to help her. And Macha was enraged at her treatment as she picked herself up to her elbows, and her exhale sounded as though they came from a neighing female warhorse. And she looked at them, and there was a snarl on her lips, and she pointed at them, and she cursed them. And she cursed them that when they were most threatened and vulnerable and in need of help, all the words of the Remembrance Knights, those old enough to grow a beard, would be struck down by the agony of the labour that she now felt. And years passed, and the spell held, for a Driocht does not forget. And I will tell you now of a story that this land will always regret.